Have you ever wondered why communities that desperately need to work together just fail to do so? I mean, we see it all the time, right? A neighborhood association that completely descends into chaos over a shared park, or, a global community struggling to make a dent in climate change. Welcome to this Explainer. Today we're going to look at collective action, not as some magical occurrence that just relies on good vibes and goodwill, but as a hardcore structural engineering challenge. How can we literally engineer a solution so people can cooperate effectively? All right, let's dive right in.
So here's the central paradox we're tackling today. Why do people who want the exact same thing fail to act together? It is incredibly frustrating to witness, but it's really crucial to understand that this failure isn't usually just some fatal flaw in human nature. Instead, it's a structural challenge. And hey, if you've ever pulled your hair out trying to manage a team project, the good news here is that structural challenges are actually designable. They're teachable. We can absolutely learn the architecture required to build strong, cooperative communities.
Now, before we get too far, let's demystify our vocabulary just a bit, because these terms get thrown around a lot, but they actually mean very different things. Let's look at the hierarchy here. Collective action is the broad category, the whole shebang, the genus. Within that, we have cooperation, which is when you accept a short-term personal cost for a shared long-term gain. Think of the classic prisoner's dilemma. Coordination, on the other hand, is when everyone already agrees on the goal, but they just need to align on the actual path to get there. It's not about selfishness, it's just mutual hesitation. So the absolute crucial point is this. Mistaking a cooperation problem for a coordination problem is a classic practitioner error. If you treat people who are just hesitating as if they're acting selfishly, well, you're going to apply the completely wrong solution.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the paradox. Second, the faulty foundation. Third, the bricks. Fourth, the cement. And finally, number 5, real-world application. Okay, let's get into it.
Section 1, the paradox. And we'll be looking at our ultimate case study, the locality compact.
Moving on to Section 2, the faulty foundation. Let's look at the 5 ways cooperation fails.
So these failures, they aren't moral failings. They're really just structural stress points. For example, Mancur-Olson gave us the famous free rider problem. He argued that in a large group, a perfectly rational individual won't contribute if they can just reap the benefits of the public good without doing any of the heavy lifting. Think of it like a sparsely attended town hall meeting where everyone is just hoping someone else will show up and make the tough decisions. Then Garrett Hardin gave us the tragedy of the commons. Imagine an open pasture where anyone can bring their animals to graze. It's individually rational for each herder to add more and more animals to their herd, right? But collectively, this just leads to overgrazing and the total destruction of the pasture.
Next up, we have 3 more structural cracks. Buchanan and Tulloch looked at the costs of voting. Specifically, they looked at the trade-off between decision costs, meaning the time it takes to actually reach an agreement, and external costs, which are the harms imposed on someone by a decision they didn't even consent to. Then there's Brian Scairms and his stag hunt concept. Picture this. 2 hunters can hunt a stag together for a huge payoff, or they can hunt a hare individually for a really small one. The failure here isn't greed. It's a mutual hesitation. It's to fear that the other person won't actually show up for the stag hunt, leaving you all alone out there in the woods. Finally, Edward Banfield introduces this concept of a cultural substrate, or amoral familialism, where a community might completely lack the generalized trust necessary for voluntary associations to form in the first place.
Now, when we map these 5 theorists and their failure mechanisms against the necessary design responses, it becomes super clear why diagnosis is just absolutely critical. If a watershed committee is falling apart because of mutual mistrust, which is a Skyarms coordination problem, but you misdiagnose it as an Olson freerider problem, you might try to punish the members with fines. That is exactly the wrong structural design response, and honestly, it will only make the mistrust worse. You have to match the right repair to the right failure.
Which brings us to Section 3, the bricks, institutional repair.
To actually repair these cracks, we turn to the groundbreaking empirical work of Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom. She basically asked a really simple question. Since communities do manage to govern shared resources for centuries without collapsing, how exactly do they pull it off? She made a crucial distinction between Hardin and herself. Hardin's famously pessimistic tragedy of the commons was actually describing an open access regime, basically a place with 0 rules. Ostrom corrected this by defining a genuine commons. You see, a genuine commons isn't a free-for-all. It has very clear rules of entry, allocation, and sanction. The misreading of Hardin has caused immense real-world damage over the years, leading governments to privatize or just take over resources because they wrongly believed communities couldn't manage them. Ostrom proved they absolutely can, provided they have the right institutional bricks.
So what exactly are those bricks? Well, Ostrom distilled her findings into 8 essential design principles. I'm going to rapid fire through a few of the most critical ones. First, you need clearly defined boundaries, basically knowing exactly who has rights to the resource and who doesn't. You also need rules that are actually congruent with local conditions. You can't just import some cookie-cutter rulebook from the outside. You absolutely must have graduated sanctions. This means first violations get a slap on the wrist or social pressure, but later ones get real material penalties. And finally, you need low-cost, really accessible conflict resolution mechanisms. These precise rules and boundaries, they are the necessary bricks for building enduring cooperation.
All right, let's move to Section 4, the cement, the psychological engine.
As theorist John Elster pointed out, institutions without internal norms are really just scaffolding without cement. You need what's called the Social Identity Model of Collective Action, or SIMCA, which relies on 3 interlocking pathways. First up, perceived injustice. That's the shared moral judgment that your group has been wronged. Second is perceived efficacy. That's the genuine, deep-down belief that your group acting together can actually produce real change. And third is social identity, which is basically the strength of your identification with that group. If an institution is built with all of Ostrom's rules, but totally ignores these 3 psychological variables, it's just going to be a hollow shell.
And this concept gets even richer when we look at the work of Sarah Brinninger and Carolyn Kelly. They found that gendered social identity isn't just a derivative of class or community. It's a distinct, incredibly potent pathway for collective action in its own right. This brilliant insight explains a lot. For instance, it explains why women's self-help groups in rural India often have significantly more energy and identity-driven momentum than the formal, more male-dominated village councils. The gendered identity essentially acts as a really powerful fuel.
But wait, there is a 4th psychological pathway here, introduced by Martijn van Zomeren, and that is moral conviction. Some people are driven not by group identity or, a calculated sense of efficacy, but by a really deep sense that something is simply morally wrong. These are your seed crystal leaders. They're the ones who keep fighting and consistently show up to the meetings, even when the group is failing or completely lacks efficacy. Identity and efficacy mobilize the broader body of the group, but moral conviction holds the seed. You absolutely need both to sustain a movement.
Which leads us to our final section, Section 5, Real-World Application, the Architecture of Locality.
If we actually apply this architectural blueprint to the ground in rural India, we get Tushar Shah's design of a local institution. This right here is essentially the mechanics of the locality compact we mentioned way back at the start. It's a massive wager that women's self-help groups, local village councils, and the state administration can successfully mesh together. Notice how it divides into 3 interconnected systems. First, the constituent system. That's your membership base. They elect the governance system, which is the board or the leaders. The governance system then demands performance from the operating system, which is the part that actually delivers the services back to the constituents. This completely anchors the concept of patronage cohesive governance. The operating system is held accountable by the governance structure, which is in turn held accountable by the members themselves.
Shah outlines 4 essential design steps to make this whole thing work. First, the core purpose must be central to the members themselves, not to some outside donor or government agency. Second, you have to build the exact right operating system to achieve that specific purpose. Third, you need that patronage cohesive governance we just talked about. And fourth, this is the real trick, retaining member allegiance. How do you do that? By ensuring that the institution continually links private benefits to continuous patronage. Think about it. If the members don't see a tangible, real-world benefit to their continued participation, their allegiance is naturally going to fade.
So, to synthesize everything we've covered in this explainer, we are left with 5 core design propositions for building collective action. Number 1, diagnose before designing. Match the exact failure mode to the right institutional repair. Number 2, design for nesting. You want to build layered structures, starting from small face-to-face groups all the way up to larger federations. Number 3, build the cultural substrate. You have to actively build trust right alongside the institution itself. Number 4, treat psychology as a variable. Deliberately construct identity, efficacy, and a sense of justice. And number 5, treat this as a constitutional moment. You are fundamentally altering the rules of how the bazaar, the market, the samaj, the society, and the sarkar, the state, actually hold each other accountable.
Which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought. As you look at your own communities, your own local boards, or even your own team projects at work with this new architectural blueprint in hand, you might find that you've perfectly designed all the rules, the voting thresholds, and the boundaries. Your institutions might have the bricks, but do they have the cement?
Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helps you build stronger, more enduring collective action, wherever you are.